to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take one giant book, break it down bit by bit, talk about it, have some fun. This season, we are doing 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, joined as always by Katie Whittemore, translator extraordinaire, and by Brian Wood, writer extraordinaire.
That's cool.
You're an extraordinaire too.
I got extraordinary now. Fantastic.
How are you two doing?
Good. How are you guys?
Pretty okay. It's nice and chilly and rainy here.
Lovely. These are really tough times right now. I tried to get my hair cut, and it's going to take a month.
Oh,
So-
no.
And I'm not really a hat person, so I don't know what to do.
God, I've seen you wear hats.
I'm just not a hat. I own one hat,
Well,
and
you,
it's for that musical Hamilton.
Yeah.
Every time I wear it, people want to talk to me about Hamilton. I've never seen it. I
who
don't-
is Hamilton?
know, but I don't do cosplay poetry slam, so I have no idea what Hamilton is. I've never seen it.
There's
My one hat is like, I get all these stupid NPR people coming up to me. Oh, what do you think? It's like, I don't know. I thought this was $1 at the Goodwill. It'll hide my head.
We have Chloe and I have a running gag with
Life
Chloe.
is hard.
Life
That's all I'm
is-
saying.
oh,
Life is very hard.
I have a running gag with Chloe that whenever she's trying out for plays, they're always like one name plays, and I always get them confused. So she's like, where are you going for? Is it Anne Frank? She's like, fucking not Anne Frank, it's Pippin. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Is it like Matilda? It's like, no. I don't know what these plays are. I don't know what any of them are. I do know Anne Frank. So
Do they still do My Fair Lady? Or
I don't think so. All they do now are like contemporary plays. That's a whole different conversation, but it is interesting how like high school musical is what they do, and that is like the starting point of everything going forward. Art has changed.
I'm working on My Fair Lady, but everybody raps.
That's perfect.
Yeah. It's gonna be awesome.
You gotta have a little bit of a little trap in there.
The rain in Spain is
Yeah.
mainly on the plane.
You could bust it.
Oh.
Drop some beats there.
No, I love, little Eliza Doolittle action.
Who doesn't like Eliza Doolittle?
Except for that play is like 19 hours long. Aside from that, I mean, it's no Carousel, which is like the worst play ever to watch.
That's one of my favorite parts in was it Waiting for Guffman? Not Waiting for Guffman. Maybe it's Waiting for Guffman, where he talks about British accents and how to do a British accent.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Something about vowels. He goes, you. And that's how Christopher Guest does a British accent. You only pronounce the vowels. You.
Oh my God.
So
So
we are reading a book.
we are reading a book, 2666, and we talked last week about some of like the end of the first episode about some of the like myth making and the Bolaño idea of who Bolaño was as an artist, which plays a large role in both like Last Words on Earth and to some degree in our reception of him. And I've been reading this book, Bolaño, A Biography and Conversations by Monica Marastain. And it's I'm not that far into it, but I'm planning on finishing it, getting further as we go along here. But the part that I got to yesterday, as I was reading, had two interesting things related to that. One is this, which is both a criticism and of interest. So Jose Maria Espinosa was a friend of his, also a writer, poet. I believe that they were the ones that got into fistfights. I might be missing, but someone talks about getting into fistfights with Bolaño because there's the Octavio Paz School of Poetry and Writing, and then the Efrain Huerta one, which is the Infrarealist, and they would like argue back and forth at a cafe. And when Bolaño, there's a part in here where one of them, that whoever it was, says, well, when Bolaño realized that he wasn't the only one who had read all these authors and that he couldn't just teach everyone about them, he would just resort to like name calling and get people's jokes out until they get so pissed that they try and beat him up. So like, I appreciate this. Reminds me of my college years. I feel an affinity now.
You feel seen?
Close. I'm seeing myself in this.
Is Espinosa Chilean as well?
No, I think he's Mexican. So here's just a couple quotes from this, and I want to read a bit of the Bolaño one to you guys. But for this, he's talking about Bolaño. He says, I think that when Roberto left, the group then for realists broke up. It's already remained, but it slowly faded until the appearance of the Savage Detectives, which gave rise to, how should I say it, something that was more mythical than real. To me, the real Roberto is the one from the stories. The Big River novels he published are full of perfect stories, but his novels, they don't achieve what they set out to do. Of course, it's very difficult to debate these things when dealing with an author from whom it's difficult to separate the textual value from its context, the sentimental value of its myth. What is unusual is that the seductive quality he had at 20 remained throughout his life and now even after his death. And then a later thing about his books, Roberto is a wild writer. His novels are reiterative. He doesn't have a well-planned structure. They're all at a constant peak. He doesn't control their pace, which is why I like the stories much better. As a representative of the second generation of post-boom writing, he injects an enormous amount of energy. Joie de vivre resounds in every phrase, which is why he can't stop. He doesn't edit, doesn't rewrite. He's incapable of self-criticism. In any case, I think that Bolaño's literary quality isn't something we should be discussing now. What needs to be discussed is the mixture between the character and the person, his relationship with the Latin American medium, which needed to see itself reflected again in a writer. Bolaño appeared when the greats like Neruda, Paz, and Borges had died, and the recognition of Vargas Llosa, Garcia Marquez, and Carlos Fuentes had become problematic, controversial, because you agreed with some of the things they said, but not others. Roberto was kind of a revelation. And I thought that that was an interesting structure for both like relating to the novels, but that persona that we've been talking about of like how that occurs, and that really doesn't fuse Irish Detectives maybe more than 2666, but it is that part of it that gives you a wider sort of reading or way of looking at these books.
Again, that's a lot of stuff. Is there like one thing in there you want to?
And the next thing I'll say is that what's interesting is the Bolaño movement and like the Imperialists of separating from the Fuentes and Garcia Marquez is parallel to the Mexican crack movement, which would have been going on a few years later, which is also a group of writers in Mexico, poets and fiction writers who are all went to the same high school, and they rebelled against the same people, although they said that like Fuentes and Garcia Marquez or whatever were the pure things, and it was everyone that came after that was imitating that sort of magical realism that was the problem, and that made them problematic. And so their big statement, which ties into Bolaño too, part of the big crack statement was that you don't need to write about Mexico or Latin America, that your stories don't need to be localized. The way that like publishers at that point in time in the 90s, 90s, were only looking, American publishers this is, were only looking for Latin American writers that did that were writing about like Macondo, that were writing about like parrots that talk, that were writing about like, you know, wise grandmothers. And the crack group was like, we want to write about Germany and the World War II and like, you know, people in other places of the world. And that's not.
Can you make it folkloric though?
Yeah, can you make it? And so Bolaño does that and represents that same thing. Although I don't think the two necessarily had any strong, like, I know Volpe knows Bolaño and wrote about him, and they're all probably connected, but I don't think they're like formally in any way connected. But it's interesting that is kind of an interesting, what do you call it, like genealogy of literary history for Latin America, of like those first generation dying, the rebellion, wanting to, there's some reference to like how Bolaño was essentially Oedipal and wanting to kill Paz so you could have a father, and that he could write what he wanted to without that situation. I don't know, this is a bunch of shit that I'm just throwing at you guys. And I think our credit card's calling me to tell me I haven't paid my bill. The other one was we talked about Llosa.
Just I thought it was really interesting.
No, I'm not going to pay you. I know I owe you. It's a fucking university hospital. I owe them a bunch of money for my daughter, and they call me every day. And I apologize to everyone listening and watching this because I've seen this. Delinquent at paying my medical bills.
Oh,
there.
So American. You just need to get diabetes now. No, I like this idea though of it's almost like he's kind of showing up at the right place at the right time, or there's this vacuum between the like who's going to be our next South American writer for North Americans to read, and it feels like something's got to fill that void, and they're kind of looking for it. This is obviously one of the names they chose.
Yeah. I mean, it is, but I think but because he comes out not of Latin America in some ways, and is more European and is more accepted in the European context before the American or Anglo-Saxon context, I think that's slightly modified.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like Garcia Marquez, and I don't know because I was obviously not alive, that those seem to be in the English translation became world phenomena.
Yeah.
And with Bolaño, it's sort of like there's this guy who I used to refer to as my arch nemesis, who is an editor at he was an agent for Wiley, which is where the arch nemesis part comes from. And I have a statement about Wiley in a second that I probably shouldn't share, but don't care. But he then became an editor at Random House, and he published the last book of Sebald's. And he gave a presentation that I was at, in which he said, well, Sebald was completely unknown in the world until I put the stamp of authenticity on him by making him a Random House author. And now he's a worldwide success. Yeah. And I was like, you are my arch nemesis. You are a villain. Now, the thing about Wiley I was going to say is we're trying to put together merchandise to support the 2-month review. And something like, we could have a coffee mugs that say like, I read 2666 with the review, or with their Bolaño's classes. And I asked the agency that represents the estate, and essentially, if we want to do anything like that, it has to be cleared through the estate and we have to pay for it. So I guess that's an off the table sort of record. Alas, just wanted to throw that out there that we should have merchandise that would be fun, but estates and myths are stronger than small publishers.
But no, the first thing I wanted to bounce off of both of you, since I mean this is more of your world than mine. But like, as far as translating literature, do you think publishers, do they want something that represents the country they're coming from, or is it more just the literature? Right? It's like that idea of like, can you be a little more folkloric? I want the wise grandma cooking to teach us a lesson about, versus just why do I want this Mexican author that's writing about Germany? Why do I want a South American writer that's going to write about Nazis? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't. Is it?
You want to say something, Katie?
No, I don't. I mean, you can say something maybe from the publishers.
What about from your perspective as pitching to people? Because I don't know what it is now compared to what it was 10 years ago. Even though I'm in it, it's easier to look back. And looking back, the main thing was whatever sold, you replicated. Right. So if it was the folklore thing, you replicated. If it was this, you replicated. You found the next version of the same.
Postmodernism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I just want like cool voices and good writing. I don't necessarily mostly I care about a place and a time, but I don't care if it fits with where the author's from. I just kind of want good shit. Yeah. Like
And there's like always that question of authenticity.
Yeah.
And that's where like we're in a weird point where I don't want to comment on appropriation.
Appropriation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can guarantee if you look at the history of books translated from Arabic between 2000 and 2012, say, it's very much like we want this Arabic, we want this world represented in this way.
Yeah.
Like those countries that don't have as broad of a literary tradition as say France or Argentina or Spain or Germany tend to get categorized into a smaller like stereotyped sort of work. And anything that's outside of that is generally not recognized. And that can go with the Nordic countries too, but like really with those ones, with Arab and Persian, and I think that I hate to say this, and like the Middle East, like the books that they're looking for have to relate to that experience. It's sort of like for a while, like German books, like the history of translation is interesting too, in the sense that one of the two of the biggest series that existed early on were the Philip Roth one of Writings from Other Europe, and then the Northwestern series that had, what was the title? Writings from an Unbound Europe, something like that. And basically all they were Eastern European books about the Eastern European experience during the Berlin Wall and Soviet times. And so like you had like, it was like, oh, we're sneaking out this information about what is happening in this part of the world that we don't have access to. And it always sort of replicated that and dealt with like those issues. And it was very interesting because structurally they were disconnected from American and British writing because they didn't have it. So it was like interesting structures that give it a literary value. But in some ways, I think the publishers were seeking this like exoticism of the Soviet.
Exotic.
And that kind of gets replicated in other ways now with the different political parts to it.
I mean, I think like in the Spanish context, I think in terms of like the exoticism, and that's less present in Spanish literature as it might be in literature from Spanish from other countries. Like I think about like current Latin American literature in translation. There's recently been, a pretty big boom in young female writers coming out of Spanish speaking Americas. And, I know, and I don't know, I mean, again, like, this is not to say like broad brush, but I think, and even, I can even link Sarah Mesa to this a little bit, who's a Spanish writer, and that there's sort of a preoccupation or an interest in women writers that write weird or dark things at this point. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's something that we're seeing a bit of a trend. For a long time, it was like in novels coming out of Spain that had to do like with the Civil War or the post-dictatorship.
Oh my God.
Dictatorship and
So many.
period. So there's a lot of that. So I think that like, right, there becomes an appetite for, like costumismo, right? Like sort of looking again at the folkloric. Right now, I mean, the stuff that I'm working on from Spanish is in almost all cases, like not localized at all. And sometimes I'm even like deliberately sort of blurred the lines to even place that that text in a particular place. I'm thinking of Wolfskin,
that's what I was thinking too,
which is coming out by Laura Moreno from Structo Press. And yeah, so I think that it's more like you said, Brian, earlier about the voices, about the stories, and so much of literature that's being written today. Also, another trend which can be more or less interesting depending on who's reading it, in terms of like, autofiction and like literature of the eye, of the first person. I mean, necessarily we're going to be sort of delving into more like, human nature type experiences in a lot of ways, as opposed to like a particularly localized happening,
Ties into a whole thing that I was working on a long time ago. Book that I wanted to write, but about mirroring in fiction. And that's where like this autofiction obsession is a bit of like mirroring and self-reflection inside of this book. But
right.
So Buyosa's thing is interesting in here. And her interview is like a longer one and includes like when they first met, and she was terrified of him because all those people like that were in his group didn't have any women. And so she was in the pause group. His group would go and like insult people or disrupt readings. And it's funny, but also like, it was like quite aggressive. So she was a little terrified. And then she met him in 1998 after Savage Detectives, and they hit it off in Vienna and stayed up all night reading, or they quote, "We're now writer colleagues and stayed up all night talking. He told me about his children, his wife, and his loves, and I did the same. The two of us almost cried. It was a very intense night." And they became like email correspondents for the rest of his life. But she has some interesting things to say about him as well. And this one's a little bit long, but let me read it. So Marcin says, from a literary point of view, how would you describe the Roberto Bolaño phenomenon? Roberto Bolaño and Buyosa. Roberto Bolaño was a very distinctive author who belonged to what I see as a very coherent world. I would place him among the great communicating vessels, such as Jose Revueltas, for example, or Octavio Paz, or Jose Agustin, whom he read very young, and with the great communicating vessels of Anglo-Saxon literature. Roberto B. was a voracious reader. 2666 is a masterpiece. Then came the fame and the Bolaño phenomenon, which I think has a painful side to it, revealing the cruelty of literature. If Bolaño hadn't died, the phenomenon wouldn't have been so large. The readers and critics who build up literary figures like the concept of an author who dies young, the idea of sacrifice, the romantic death, if you like. The truth is that it upsets me greatly. It upsets me because I knew Roberto, because he was a very dear friend to me, and I don't at all like the idea of him being dead, so I can't be comfortable with the culture of cadaver eaters. The other thing that irritates me greatly is when people claim that he wasn't a Latin American author, or that he was the only Latin American author. Bolaño is his own father, like any self-respecting author, but he looks much better in literary terms next to his peers. So I don't like the cult of death. I don't like the de-Chileanized or de-Mexicanized Bolaño. If Bolaño had gotten his liver, he'd still be with us writing wonderful books. And I think that that's interesting for a bunch of reasons. I'm going to come back to one of them real quick. The other thing is that she criticizes Jonathan Lethem in here, who Lethem wrote about Bolaño and wrote the review of 2666 for the New York Times. And Marcine's like, what do you not like about this? And Buyosa says, well, the fact that Lethem places Bolaño in the tradition of the Anglo-Saxon authors that both he and Bolaño like. The Lethem is completely different than Bolaño. They have absolutely nothing in common. They have different blood. Their genetic message is radically different. they have very slight things in common that he then exaggerates because he doesn't know what the context and what so makes Bolaño a kind of beatnik novelist, which he isn't. What Bolaño really is a literary animal, which is a great line too.
Love that.
But I think that that's really interesting of like that construction of like creating the lineage for him and where you're reading him from ties into what you're saying about like the American perspective of looking for something like that. And there is like the context building of who I've read, I see reflected in Bolaño, and that's different than what someone else has read seeing reflected in Bolaño, especially if it's like a Latin American reader versus an American like reader, given the amount of translations and everything else. And didn't end with the question, but I do have a one more question for you, Katie, specifically, and we can get into this and then get into the book. So she references how he is not, that she really wants him to be a Latin American writer and that should not be ignored. And one of the things I was thinking when I started reading the section for this week was that this translation is so crisp and moving, and it reminds me more of a Latin American translation and Latin American writing than does most like Spanish writing, which tends to be more florid, more Baroque, lots more subclauses, less direct in that sense. And I've heard people talk about this before. Frazan's talked about it to me of like that the written Spanish is very like high and pitch very high. It's sort of like, not to use one quick example, like the Javier Marias being like a standard Spanish writer. This is what I think of Spanish writing distilled at this moment in time. This is just a random sentence. When someone is in love, or more precisely, when a woman is in love and in the early stages of an affair, when it still has all the allure of the new and the surprising, she is usually capable of taking an interest in anything that the object of her love is interested in or speaks about. Like it's a long, comma-filled, clause-written sentence, and that seems to be something I see in like some of the books that you've translated, like the Laura Moreno book, and then in other books like Latin American books like Cortázar, Biosa, another younger writer, Guadalupe Natal. These Latin American books are so much more direct and so much more like visceral in that sense. And Bolaño does seem to me to be more aligned with that. But since you've read it in Spanish, is that an accurate statement to make?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would. Yeah, I think that is accurate. I mean, I remember when I was first studying, I mean, the first translation course I ever took was in an independent study that I did in Madrid in 2008. And I remember some of my exercises were translating some Bolaño pieces. At that time, it was from the La Universidad Desconocida, his poetry and sort of like fragmentary texts. And I remember having a conversation with my literature professor, and we were talking about language and choosing and like sort of vocabulary choices and things like that in the translation of Bolaño. And I mean, it would be so fascinating to talk to Natasha about this, which hopefully we can do at some point. But the idea is that, I think, yes, we definitely can situate him within like a Latin American literary tradition. At the same time, like his writing is really cosmopolitan, I think, in the sense that it's also not super localized as Latin American literature. Yeah. So I think that's at least reflected for me in the kind of Spanish that's used. He doesn't write like a Chilean, he doesn't write like with like Chilean vocabulary or Mexican vocabulary in every case. I mean, obviously, like if a character is talking in that and it's useful in that situation, maybe that's where it appears. Or I've seen like Liz when this is cool for I thought of this in this section. That there's a part where Natasha Wimmer writes, Liz is talking about someone who wears short pants, not trousers.
Yes.
And I thought, isn't that funny? And I thought, oh, duh, she's translating Liz Norton, who's British. And so I think that's pretty cool. But in terms of like Bolaño's language as a whole, I feel like it's pretty cosmopolitan and sort of, and not super local. And yes, it's absolutely true that in a lot of Spanish literature, there's a lot of commas and a lot of clauses. You find out like the sentence starts and then there's a paragraph and you find out like at the bottom who it's referring to, for example.
Yeah. A la reading Luis Guida Solo. What's up?
No, I was just going to say, that was an interesting part of the process of translating Javier's book. Because, he's writing about a Bolaño-like figure, and the last section of the book is in Funes's voice, and it is more direct than, say, the voice of the Enrique Villamata's stand-in, which is this really that was really hard to translate, and there were some times where we had to really kind of tone it down. It doesn't work in English. It's really tough to read for the English reader to follow that list of subordinate, clauses. So, absolutely. I mean, those are certainly all choices, but I think, Natasha would be so interesting to hear from on what she did.
I have one last comment related to this, and then we should jump into more specifics. I think I can go from this to the more specifics. One story I heard was that Javier Calvo, who is Mara Fe Litham's husband, so following that Litham trail, he's one of the main translators of American books into Spanish, including Infinite Jest, including the popular contemporary books he's translated into Spanish. But since he's based in Spain, and I don't know this for certain, but the thing I've heard is that they tend to be closer to the Spain Spanish writing than they are to the American start of writing. That he's incorporating it into that higher-minded, more sort of writing. And that there's this book by Laura Fernandez, who I know that is basically based on American pop culture references that she knows through Javier Calvo's translations of them into Spanish. And so there's a weird double translation thing going on where she's reflecting on American pop culture. So to translate her book into English, it's like an indirect loop. It's going through so many levels of what Terminator is. It's not Terminator as I know it. It's Terminator as someone who read about Terminator in this other way. I don't know why I'm choosing Terminator. It's called Counterland. I guess that's why.
Let's just bring Terminator in.
Why not, man? I'll be back. Back.
Look, Brian's awake. Look, Brian's awake.
But someone was asking, and there's two things in the chat that are interesting. One is we can make Arcamboldi merchandise, no problem, and there's some good suggestions in here. So we have a thread to go on to make Arcamboldi things. The second is talking about Edwin Johns as a figure similar to Bolaño in the sense of or similar to that idea of the corpse eating.
Yeah, it goes back to that corpse eating idea.
Yep, in which and I know you wanted to talk about the section, and what was mentioned in the chat is that he says that he cut off his hand for money and to play the game, and that is very much an interesting, relevant part of Bolaño wouldn't want to destroy the myth of 20-year-old rebellious Bolaño because that's valuable,
right?
But you wanted to talk about a different section in there, I know. Take it away, Katie. I've talked.
Okay. Oh, all right. Well, there's a couple things that I want to bring up. One is the notion of coincidence and fate and recurrence that we're starting to already get a sense of in the first part. And, we're seeing that with dreams, and we're seeing that with sort of this doubling of and mirroring, right? So we have the attack that, that Pelletier and Espinosa perpetrate on the taxi driver in London. And then we get to Mexico. The critics make their way to Mexico, hot on the trail of Arcamboldi after a, hot tip from a young Mexican literature student. And
they don't
and then we get there, and then there's a, and then we see the sort of this underground war happening between the hotel doorman and taxi drivers. So we're seeing these mirror moments, and I think that we start to, as readers, we're sort of amassing in our brain, consciously or unconsciously, this series of references, echoes, callbacks to different parts. And so I'm curious about what you guys make of that. And I think there's a really interesting place where we can look on my page 89. This is when so Espinosa is telling the story of when he, Pelletier, and Marini go to Switzerland to the insane asylum where Edwin Johns, the painter, the self-mutilating painter, is living. and they have sort of this meeting in a little cottage with Edwin Johns. And so basically, and then what happens in there is that there's John's nurse is reading a book of 20th century German literature, and they ask, is Archibaldian there? And she says, yes. And then they're like, oh my God, holy shit, what a coincidence. And John says, well, I gave her that book. And basically he's like, you can believe or not believe in coincidences, but like the whole world is a coincidence. This is John's perspective. And then he says, but I have this friend.
Yeah.
Right. And he says, my friend says the world is not a coincidence for everyone, and that it has to do in some ways with suffering, right? For the person who has no choice but to get up and pile more suffering on the suffering he's already accumulated. Suffering is accumulated, said my friend. That's a fact. And the greater the suffering, the smaller the coincidence. Okay, so that's important. And then down at the bottom, Johns continues talking about this friend, right? He says, all right, so coincidence isn't a luxury. It's the flip side of fate and something else besides. Well, what else? What is that something else? Something my friend couldn't grasp for a reason that's simple and easy to understand. My friend, if I may still call him that, believed in humanity. And so he believed in order, in the order of painting and the order of words, since words are what we paint with. He believed in redemption. Deep down, he may have even believed in progress. Coincidence, on the other hand, is total freedom, our natural destiny. Coincidence obeys no laws, and if it does, we don't know what they are. Coincidence, if you'll permit me the simile, is like the manifestation of God at every moment on our planet. A senseless God making senseless gestures at his senseless creatures. In that hurricane, in that osseous implosion, we find communion, the communion of coincidence and effect, and the communion of effect with us. So this is fascinating because it's introducing a couple of things. One is this dichotomy of fate versus coincidence, which we can talk about. Well, what is Bolaño's position possibly? Like, is he the friend or is he John's? In terms of what he's showing us in the book. And then the other thing is, and I think this is going to be important too with some of the imagery that we'll continue to see, is this sort of this introduction of like religious imagery as well. We're talking about redemption. We're talking about communion. Okay. Now, can you guys stay with me? Because now I'm going to go to one more place that's a little complicated. And then I want to see if we can see how this hangs together. Okay. So I started looking and thinking, all right, so here we've got like this idea of, belief in humanity. Belief in humanity supposes a belief in order, which supposes a belief in the order of words. And we can extrapolate that and say belief in art. Belief in humanity equals belief in art, right? Mm-hmm. And it really is a belief in fate.
Yes.
Right? So we're talking about, so the difference between fate and coincidence in this case would be coincidence is this like willy-nilly, it's absolute freedom. And fate, there's something that's guiding fate, right? That's the idea. Coincidence is just casual, right? And fate would be something's causing it, right? Okay, so then, and all of these words like redemption, not everyone, had literary theory banged over their head for a great many years of their life. But when you start talking about like redemption and you start talking about these kinds of ideas, like I can't help but think of Walter Benjamin always, because he just is always coming up in my life anyway. But then later, okay, so this is where I want to connect this. Two places. On page 135 in my edition, this is when, all right, so Liz Norton is leaving Mexico. She's basically like, she's done with her two critic lovers. They've actually had their real threesome, and now she's like done, right? And she's going to leave Santa Teresa. Like she can't take it anymore. So she has the sense that something is going on, that there's something that she can perceive that is happening, right? And that gives us a sense of that, like for Liz, this is not a coincidence. For Liz, these things have meaning and there's some greater design, right? Yeah. So she leaves, and they bring her to the airport, and then they come back, and Pelletier and Espinosa are back in Santa Teresa, okay? And they say, and this is, then I'm going to stop. After that moment, reality for Pelletier and Espinosa seemed to tear like paper scenery. And when it was stripped away, it revealed what was behind it, a smoking landscape, as if someone, an angel maybe, was tending hundreds of barbecue pits for a crowd of invisible beings. So now we have the idea, right? Again, so it's a religious image, but it's also an image that calls to mind, you know, the idea of history with a capital H, the idea of Benjamin's angel of history, which basically, for those that aren't familiar, it's like he was responding to a Klee painting of the Angelus Novus, right? And what he says, if anyone wants to summarize it, they can, if they remember off the top of their heads, but I also have it open on my computer. But I'm talking way too much.
Go for it. Explain.
Can I say one more thing?
Because it ties into a thing I want to point out.
Okay, all right. I swear this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then you guys are going to just jump in and analyze it. Okay, so this is Walter Benjamin writing about this image of the Angelus Novus, Klee's painting, and it's what inspires him to talk about his idea of what history is, Benjamin's idea of what history is. Now remember, Benjamin is a German philosopher and critic who's writing in like World War II, Holocaust times. He actually went to Spain to escape and died there rather mysteriously in Portbou. Okay, so he's talking about sort of we're talking about like the catastrophe of the 20th century, which I think is really important for Bolaño, even though he's writing on the eve of the 21st century. That's something else we could look at. Okay. Okay. He's describing the angel. Okay. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing in from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close them. So he's being blown back. He's facing the past. He's being blown into the future, and he can't see the future, okay? The storm irresistibly propels him into a future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him, the past, grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Now, if that doesn't tie in to Santa Teresa, I don't know what does. So, yes, go.
Me? I totally agree. One of the things that comes up out of I'll do my hobby horse in a second, but one of the ones that all of that you're talking about reminds me of is on page 79, where there's a dream again, and Pelletier sees, he began to weep as he watched what was left of a statue emerging from the bottom of the metallic sea, a formless trunk of stone, gigantic, eroded by time and water, though a hand, a wrist, part of a forearm could still be made out with total clarity. And the statue came out of the sea and rose above the beach, and it was horrific and at the same time very beautiful. The hobby horse part of this is that everything you were talking about is essentially the Crying Lot 49 in the Pynchon view of history.
Okay,
like,
so
it's
tell us that.
So essentially the Crying Lot 49 setup is that things happen and they're coincidence or fate. And depending on how you're positioned, they either give life meaning or give life a sense of chaos. And then the idea of like the history is that it is sometimes chances, but it's these coincidental things that keep happening. With in his big idea about the sort of terror and beauty that is at the heart of this is that anarchism, or like the real true revolution, is when the idea that a whole new world can be born on top of the one that's here, and that everything could just instantly change. And there's something about that with like the way you look at fate or coincidence flips those things and flips the way that sequence or see the meaning within their linkages. But the Johns thing directly reminds me, that whole speech reminds me of Pynchon like nothing else in this book.
Really?
Yeah. It's the first thing I thought of. I didn't, but I love that, and I love that what you're doing with piecing these all together, because it is very true, and it is part of the interesting thing of like the doubling and the coming back to stuff and how you view it. So, for instance, when you were talking about the doubling, I don't even remember which one you mentioned. Oh, the taxi driver thing. The one that I was thinking of this morning is the relationship between once they go back at the beginning of our section, they go back from the fighting, beating the shit out of the taxi driver, and then they don't see Norton for a while, and they both get involved with like whores and brothels.
Right.
But Pelletier gets involved with this woman named Vanessa, and like gets really involved with her. And there's a line that Espinosa says that something like whores are meant to be fucked, not psychoanalyzed. And then some pages later, he gets involved in Santa Teresa with this girl, Rebecca, who's selling rugs and essentially doing a similar sort of thing. They're both like sort of paralleling. One is treating like a whore and psychoanalyzing, and he's treating a girl and turning her into a whore. And so they sort of like have this back and forth vision there of that sort of reflective nature. And I think that it is really interesting because all of these pieces that do bounce off one another or show up end up seeming to fall into that coincidence fate idea based on how you want to read them. How much meaning do you want to ascribe to this? How much of it is ordered on purpose? How much of it is not? And this is a book that where this section, I feel like the beginning is very fluid and fast and loose, and then the end is structured, where it has like this repeating 3-part sequence where it's Espinosa going out with Rebecca, Espinosa coming back to the hotel where Pelletier is reading the book, and then part of Liz's letter to both of them in which she rejects them both and goes off to Marini for the time being. And I think that that's interesting. I think that this is going off on a different topic, but part of what we were talking about before of the voids and the sort of like attractiveness of like the black hole of Santa Teresa or of an obsession. You have the black hole of an obsession. They were obsessed with Liz. That goes away. Like there's a sense of never having that fulfilled that comes throughout this too. That's sort of religious as well. Like you never get that fulfillment. And the moment where Espinosa's like, I'm not even reading Arcamboldi anymore.
I know. He forgot that he had the books in his suitcase.
Yeah, that I think is really telling of like this transition of that obsession.
Well, I think what's interesting too, and this just came to me with another double, which I think is related again to like this idea of like the barbecue pits and the fire and the idea that like reality shreds, like, so their reality is coming apart at the seams, right? And what they glimpse through the surface is this hellish landscape, which to me, what I picture is the image on the Spanish cover of like, you know, the orange and sort of yellow desert, and then the person. So it's like this sort of like wasteland apocalypse place, right? So again, like there is this sort of element of religiosity, I think that's interesting. The one other double I wanted to bring up is...
Can I double that really quick? Wait, what's your other double? Doubling what you're just saying is Amalfitano's speech about like what it's like to be an artist in Mexico and be hired into like that the public service sort of hires you away. And basically all they are is like standing on a stage, not seeing the roaring deep behind them and trying to talk to an audience that doesn't give a shit. And then slowly like the words keep coming and they keep misinterpreting them and failing at it. And I think that doubles what you're saying about it doubles the burning pit sort of thing and the idea that they're not seeing the reality. They're representing
their back is turned.
The back is turned, the Plato in the cave situation.
So the other double that I wanted to bring up, and this is just a small thing, but you know, last week, Chad, you asked about the Swabian story and like that weird thing about the Argentine when they go to Argentina. Okay, so on page 130, right, the 3 critics, they get invited to the lamb barbecue by like the rector of the university, right? So it says on page 130, and yes, in fact, they went to the lamb barbecue and their movements were measured and cautious as if they were 3 astronauts recently arrived on a planet about which nothing was known for sure. On the patio where the barbecue was being held, they gazed at several smoke pits. The professors of the University of Santa Teresa displayed a rare talent for feats of country living. 2 of them raced on horseback.
Boom.
And so, you know, it's this interesting sort of callback to here they are, again, the Europeans sort of descending on the wild sort of west of the American continent and calling back to that. And then of course, like, you know, the smoke pits, again, this sort of idea of like, I don't know, both destruction, catastrophe, hellfire.
Also a cleansing. Fire can be cleansing in terms of art symbolism as well, of like scraping away. And like in some ways, when they tear away the reality and what they end up seeing later on is that Central Trace is a place where hundreds of women are being murdered and are brutally, and you want to burn that all down in some sense. But it is also a burning cesspit.
But just look at the imagery you get at the end of this scene as well, right? Where they dug up the barbecue, smell of meat and hot earth spread over the patio, and a thin curtain of smoke that enveloped them all like the fog that drifts before a murder, and vanished mysteriously as the women carried the plates to the table.
There's a lot of occurrences of the word vanished in this part that we read, like a lot. I have two doubles to do here. So the first one is, I think this is who you referenced before, Katie. On 138, it says someone spoke the name Albert Kessler when they're talking about the crimes, right? Okay, so Albert Kessler is based on Robert Ressler. And Robert Kenneth Ressler was the FBI agent and author who played a significant role in the psychological profiling of violent offenders in the 70s and is credited with coining the term serial killer. He is where is it in here? Finding it. He went to Ciudad Juarez in Mexico to investigate the still active femicides occurring there and served as an inspiration for the character Albert Kessler in Roberto Bolaño's novel 2666. Second one, do either of you know what the name, do you remember the name that Arcamboldi goes by in Mexico?
Hans Ritter, writer?
Yeah, do you know who that is?
Mm-mm.
Hans Ritter is a real person. Hans Ritter was a German Nazi physician and war criminal who conducted medical experiments and racial hygiene. Is an angel of that. Yep. So,
and they believe that's his real name.
Yeah, and they believe that that's his real name.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is, I wonder why he's hiding.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Because there's a very funny line in page 120. Statistically speaking, there isn't a single German born in 1920 who hasn't changed addresses at least once in his life.
I love that.
Statistically speaking.
Very true. I wondered if you, Katie, had any comments on, because you talked about the dream last week with Marini. I wonder if you had any comments on all the dreams that show up here as to like any way of framing or thinking about them. I mean, I thought that Liz's seems kind of interesting in that there's like her dream that recurs is that she's in her room with the two mirrors and she's being reflected into both, but is not the woman at the center, seeing a different woman at the center of this double reflection, which seems to represent a way of seeing her relationship with Pelletier and with Espinosa, of like she's a figment or a vision of a woman that's in both of their eyes or being seen by their eyes. But that she's separate from that. So it's I don't know, but the other ones, I didn't have like a good read on them, but I do think every time a dream shows up in here, isn't it? Who is it? Is it John Gardner that's like write a dream, lose a reader?
Oh, really?
Famous line. It's like a craft line of like, you know, write a dream, you'll lose a reader. Nobody wants to read about dreams. And like the proliferation of dreams. I think Shaban mentions this when he tries to read Finnegan's Wake, is the same thing of like, I hate dreams are dumb, blah, blah, blah. But the proliferation of them in here is pretty interesting to me.
Just do whatever you want to do, just don't suck.
Yeah, don't die and don't suck is like really the only motto to live by.
I'm interested in, I think Liz's dream about, you know, seeing like she's terrified because she's going to see at some point the women are going to face each other. And when she sees that double, she says, oh, look, she's just like me, but she's dead. And that's sort of part of the thing that spurs her then to go. But I'm kind of interested in going back to Pelletier's dream, Chad, that you referenced, which ends in like the statue, the ancient or the old statue emerging from the sea. And something that's weird, I don't know, this is just something that's curious, is that this idea of like, you know, and then what they see is everything's almost destroyed, but there's the hand, the wrist, and the forearm, you know, and we're talking about John's so much in this section, who cuts off, you know, his hand and the wrist, and what that means, and what happens to Liz when she sees it at the gallery too, right? So so John's is really, really important, an important thread for kind of like all the, like the action that things start to happen, right? And like choices are made and actions are taken around sort of being spurred on by John's legacy, I guess. So, but what could this, I think this dream is important. And I think this dream is important in terms of like how Bolaño is setting up, again, this vision of history and progress. And I don't want to talk necessarily about religion in like a godly sense, but the idea, like, so you've got the masses, like there's like, you know, the sunbathers on the beach, and they're all just like doing their thing, sunbathing. And every once in a while, you know, they get up and they go and they look off in the horizon, and then they return to what they're doing, right? Yeah. And eventually they start to leave, and they're leaving the beach. And what happens? The water starts to move, and this image, this statue is born from the past, right? Out of the waves. Like what do we make of that? Like, it's a really specific image.
What's interesting is that the image that it reminds me of, I just had it and I just lost it as I was trying to look up the picture, is the references the angel on Reforma in Mexico City.
Oh yeah.
Which is, can't see that.
Yep.
Metallic angel with its arm raised, growing up, and it's the independent.
Oh.
And that those two things link to me of seeing them as a similar sort of image between the two. But I also think that there's a lot in this section of the dream interpretation of that and other ones that I think is going back to like the Pynchon idea, or what we talked about last week of like, there's this religious reverence for Arcamboldi or whatever, but you can never get to the divine. It will destroy you. You can only come so close. And it's sort of like the way that, like, one of the things I thought was funny in here is how Pelletier is like, I just want to see Arcamboldi to find out whose mask it was. like you want an answer to a thing. And like, there's something about what you're saying with religion and with the iconography and with the sort of representation of it, of that idea that the divine is unknowable and yet is sort of directing things, and depending on how I don't know, how close you come or how you represent it. And I think of like, I'm babbling now and this probably doesn't make any sense, but I also think of like professors in that sense, where they're sort of like trying to direct you towards something, but also like never get that close.
Yeah.
Like they're not creators, they're not artists, they're analyzers. So you're always a step removed. And like the reality of things are always like a little bit more horrifying and a little bit more beautiful than you can represent. And Bolaño seems to dance around that idea of like these black holes, the things that are known that can't be seen, all that, like the influences that are there. There's one other thing we should mention just as a placeholder, is that Espinosa is in the morning, is having his morning drink, and a tall guy comes out of the bathroom and goes and sits by himself, and he thinks that could be Arcamboldi, which every time they reference him, I always think, hello, big German, is all I can ever think whenever they reference his size. But he references him, sees him, and says it couldn't be Arcamboldi, he's too young, and then goes on. And I think that's worth mentioning.
And it's like they go to the when they go to the circus, and the guy's name is like Andy Perez or something, and he's like, I don't think Arcamboldi's going to be in a circus, and he's like, well, it's the only German we've heard of. Like, there's no other Germans.
There's no Germans. Thank
God. My God.
But yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to point out or mention?
Well, I guess under, feeling this like religious vibe is going on, that dream that you did mention just now, it reads very much like Revelation. Yeah, especially Revelation chapter 13.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about that? I know, I forgot, Brian. Can you remind me about your?
Oh, I happen to have to memorize as part of my being a cult leader. You have to memorize scripture so you can say it whenever you want.
Because I remember this from another.
You just looked it up.
But I remember this from another TMR.
It's very similar, where it's horrific and beautiful at the same time. Mm-hmm. So it's Revelation 13. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. And it describes what it is.
Beast.
Right.
666.
Yeah.
666.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Yeah. And they were barbecuing lamb. Oh my God, the lamb.
And the lamb. The sacrificial smoking lamb.
I'm seeing giant Germans everywhere now.
Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. Let's talk about the beast. And let's talk about the Revelation and the Apocalypse. Okay. And how, and again, I think these are just seeds that are like sprinkled in this first section that we're picking up on. And I think there's going to be a really cool, like deeper analysis that we can do as we go through on this. But
Spoilers,
what?
No spoilers.
I'm not giving a spoiler. I'm just saying patterns.
Patterns.
They're present.
Wow.
No, but I think it's interesting for us to think a little bit about two things. One is this idea of like the religious sort of symbolism, like straight out of the Bible, like straight out of Revelations, right? And then I think we also have to think about some of, the 20th century philosophy, dialectical philosophy about history, the capital H, and the idea, Benjamin, and Benjamin really talking also about the Messiah and about the Antichrist. I mean, there's a linkage there that is not really religious, but that has to do with human progress and what we are progressing toward and what has to happen for like a new world to be born, basically, right? So there has to be an apocalypse at some point. And so like we're talking about, we're on the border, the US-Mexican border. It's like this city that is just proliferating. Its edges are just spreading and growing with the maquiladoras, with these, they say at one point, they say like they drive up to the city from the south, and it looks just like a gypsy camp or like a refugee camp that at any minute could just pick up and walk away. So there's this sense of like proliferation and impermanence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to read this within that context too, like of borders and physical borders, of globalization, of sort of like, well, what do these women that we're starting to get this sense of something really bad is happening? What can they represent?
Here's the true
horror. The beast.
Here's the true horror in this. It's on page 147. They ended up at a McDonald's in the city center.
Irony of ironies. There's a list I sent you guys of like it's like things that Bolaño talked about with his friend Frazan. And number one is how sad it is that so many Latin American evenings end at McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Okay, well here you go. You got it right there.
The thing that when you're talking about Benjamin and history that reminds me of is it's been decades since I read this, but the Education of Henry Adams, and a lot that was written about the dynamo at that moment in time, and that the beginning of the 20th century is the beginning of electricity, and that from that moment on things are going down a path in which we end up with that dialectical materialism and in different power structures and whatnot, and it leads towards a destructive nature. That this sort of mechanization and technology is both positive and tears up part of the past and comes out of like something like that. It also reminds me, and this could tie into the beast idea too, is the old theory of the Virgin and the Dynamo is what someone put in the chat, and that's exactly what it is.
Virgin and the Dynamo.
Virgin and the Dynamo. There's that old idea that, God, what was his name? I'm gonna forget. But there are a bunch of those like the Cthulhu believing writers and Lovecraftian people wanted to have a ritual in the like 1930s when they're like wanting to build rocket ships and like change the world, and they thought that they could open up and access another reality. This is the basis to tie this into the other hobby horse. This is the basis for Twin Peaks and the Black Lodge, is that there's a White Lodge and a Black Lodge, and you can access them, bring them to Earth at certain points in time, and it revolutionizes the world. And they performed this ritual. They really did perform this ritual, and believed years later that they'd fucked up and let evil into the world, which led to like the world wars and led to everything falling apart in the 20th century. That they had done the ritual wrong and opened a gate to the Black Lodge. And both of those things seem to like, I don't know, they both like influenced my look at what you're talking about, Katie, in relation to both history and the imagery in here.
Yeah.
Well, I do like where they were at that one conference where the huge coincidence happens where they get the lead on where Archambaldi might be. And they call themselves apostles.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Which I don't want to try to lean in too much on this stuff, but it's like, well, you're apostles of this mysterious figure that doesn't really exist necessarily. other than the words that they have, and what are you following and to what end?
Yeah.
Well, he is the Bible.
So I just thought that was really, the mystery of like following this text to what you're going to find out about this person. And so I just thought that was really, really cool.
There's a comment that they're not the apostles, they're the mean girls.
Yeah, they are mean.
And again,
they're like,
everyone's mediocre to them. Amalfitano, they're like us, mediocre.
And again, back with what Chad said with that angel of death idea with the German doctor. I'm not German, said Dr. Koenig.
Yeah.
Right? And the end of his act is
interesting.
He starts with fleas, and then he goes with pigeons, then a cat, and then a dog, and I end the act by disappearing a kid.
I'm telling you, if you counted up the number of disappearing words about disappearance or vanishing in this section, it would be astronomical. Like if you did one of those textual analyses things and ran it through, there's a lot. I had a bunch circled in here where it just shows up over and over again.
It's funny, but this section creeps me out.
Yeah.
I was really unnerved.
So there's like a couple of, throughout this section, when they get to Santa Teresa, there's all these parts where it ends sort of on a line like that, Brian. Like I had that highlighted too, because, in principle, like what they're discussing is this magic act. Like no one's really disappearing children, but we know that people are disappearing. And so there's these, it's like, there's the thing about the barbecue, the smoking pits, and like the women carrying basically like the flesh. And then just paragraphs later, they see someone like tending the pits in the desert for like a host of unseen beings. And so it's these things where you're like, okay, well, they're not saying that they're like roasting bodies in the desert, but that's kind of what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
And there was another one like where, so he sort of like ends on these like little zingers where like, okay, here, this is just why this sounds really creepy to me, but it's not. Okay, this is on page 147. This is after they go to McDonald's, right? And so
is that when he has the dream about the blood and the feces and all that?
Oh, there's that. No, so they go to McDonald's, and this is the last line, like in this section. And Espinosa asked Rebecca to go for a walk around the neighborhood, right? As they left, they saw the boy up on the roof of the car. He was reading a comic book and had something in his mouth, probably candy. When they got back from the walk, the boy was still there, although he wasn't reading anymore, and his candy was gone. And it's like, okay, nothing's happening there, but I'm like, oh my God, what's happening to the candy? It's just this sense of dread in these sort of mundane and like banal moments where you and I think that what we are feeling possibly as readers is what Liz gives voice to when she says, wait, I had it written down, that part where she says, oh yeah, here it is. Where Liz is talking about in the letter, or maybe it wasn't in the letter, maybe it's before she gets to the letter.
I think if it's what you're thinking of, I think it is in the letter.
Where is it?
Have it? I don't have that one for you.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm getting there. Is it? Are you talking about the part essentially where she's like?
Okay, here it is.
Yeah.
Sorry, page 113 for me. Okay, this is like when they're watching like the drunk Americans, the tourists who just are getting up and like doing stupid shit, and Willie Nelson is playing. Okay, so she's like, Norton. Okay, so Espinosa and Pelletier say these people are crazy, and she said, but Norton thought something strange was going on the street, on the terrace, in the hotel rooms, even in Mexico City with those unreal taxi drivers and doormen, unreal or at least logically ungraspable. And even in Europe, something strange had been happening, something she didn't understand. At the Paris airport where the three of them had met, and maybe before, with Marini and his refusal to accompany them, with that slightly repulsive young man they had met in Toulouse, with Dieter Hellfeld and his sudden news about Archamboldi. And something strange was going on, even with Archamboldi and everything Archamboldi had written about, and with Norton, unrecognizable to herself, if only intermittently, who read and made notes on and interpreted Archamboldi's books. So it's that creeping sense of something underlying all of our reality.
Yep. I have one last double to point out that is one of the weirder ones that shows up in here. I forgot about it until this moment. On page 139, when Espinosa first meets Rebecca, she looks at him. She says yes with a naturalist that made him smile. Who am I? Asked Espinosa. The Spanish man who bought a rug for me. The girl said. We talked for a while, and that's a reference to his dream on page 131, in which or not 131. What does that say? I just lost it. His dream earlier, where he dreams of going and buying a rug and talking to this girl for a long period of time, or that she talks and he can't talk. Here it is. It is 131. Sorry. Espinosa dreamed about a girl who sold rugs. He wanted to buy a rug, any rug, and the girl showed him lots of rugs, one after the other, without stopping. Her thin, dark arms were never still and had prevented him from speaking, prevented him from telling her something important, from seizing her by the arm and getting her out of there.
Ah!
So wait, had they not been to like the artisan market when he dreamt that?
I don't remember, to be honest. I don't remember.
Yeah, no.
Who drove us back here?
They had.
That's Pelletier.
They had. Okay.
You did.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is on page 125.
125.
Got an Indian rug from a girl who had a rug in Serape's stall. She asked what they were from, and they chat. Okay. She also said she was in high school. Oops, we didn't talk about that.
We can slide right by that one.
Okay. She was from in high school, and if things went well, she planned to study to become a nurse.
Right.
She wasn't just pretty, but intelligent too, thought Espinosa, though possibly too thin and delicate for her taste. Not too delicate for his taste when he dresses her up in stockings and a black teddy.
And then
tells her, like, okay, I'm going back to Spain, but maybe I'll marry you.
That part I think ties into, so I want to read that because I've underlined that because I think it's like sort of telling of the femicide side of things that is not so much a spoiler. That night he brought Rebecca to the hotel, and after they had showered together, he dressed her in a thong and garters and black tights and a black teddy and black spike-heeled shoes and fucked her till she was no more than a tremor in his arms.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of stuff going on here.
And this is really interesting because I think that there's a I know we could just keep talking, but there's this idea, like at first with her, like he's courting her. So we see him like maybe this is sort of this representational role that they're both playing, but he's courting her and he seems to care for her. He seems to care about the little brother. You know, the first time that they have sex, it's sort of like it's referred to as making love. Like that's what, and so I was actually curious too about in the Spanish looking at that, like, you know, so when it switches from making love and then he dresses her up and fucks her. But at the beginning, it's like he asks her, does she want to make love?
Yes.
And she says yes. And then it ends in this way. And we just can't forget that she's in high school. Yeah. So here is this European critic. It's like
older gentleman.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely at least in his 40s.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say too.
Yeah.
So anyways, well, we should probably wrap up here. Next week, I'm going to tease a couple things though. One is that I do want to go back to Amalfitano's speech in here at some point in time, but preferably in a bonus episode when we talk about your thesis, Katie, because I think it relates to this specific thing that he describes kind of well. I also think it's super funny that it ends with Norton saying, I don't understand a word you've said. Really, I've just been talking nonsense, which is a wonderful line. The second thing is next week's bonus episode should be an interview with Emily Hall, who's a writer, a fiction writer, and a art critic. And she wants to talk about the section that we're reading for next week, which is the entirety of the part of Amalfitano. And she also wants to talk about the artwork on the cover of the 3 volumes of the trilogy version of the book publication, because she's aware of the artists and what they represent and how they might kind of bounce off of this. So that's a teaser for next week's bonus. We don't have a bonus this week, which is why we're running a little bit long. Anyways, favorite lines, anyone?
Oh,
I've got one as soon as I can find it. My favorite is intellectuals always think they deserve better.
That's good. Let me see. Okay.
Mine. I'll do 2 lines. It's kind of a bit of a double. One is when Pelletier gives a gift to the prostitute he's with. He gives her a book, and she says, "It's as if you were giving me a part of you," said Vanessa. And then later we get it where Morini brings a book on photographs. They're interpretations, said Morini. The French photographer is the best, he said. The one I like the least is the American, too showy. He's too eager to discover Brunelleschi, to be Brunelleschi. The German isn't bad, but the French one is best, I'd say. You'll have to tell me what you think. I just thought I don't know what it means necessarily, but this book of these photographers trying to understand somebody through their photographs, and none of them are actually capturing it, but more telling them more about themselves than the subject.
And they're all looking at the same subject and seeing a different interpretation. Well, Brian, one of my lines comes right off the back of yours when Vanessa says, it's as if you were giving me a part of you. And he says, it left him confused because on the one hand, it was perfectly true. But on the other hand, though in another way, it wasn't true, because sometimes, especially since he and Espinosa had given up their trips to London and stopped seeing Norton, Archamboldi's work, his novels and stories that is, seemed completely foreign, a shapeless and mysterious verbal mass, something that appeared and disappeared capriciously, literally a pretext, a false door, a murderer's alias, a hotel bathtub full of amniotic fluid in which he, Jean-Claude Pelletier, would end up committing suicide for no reason, gratuitously, in bewilderment, just because. Nothing like a little amniotic bathtub to end the episode.
Okay. So we'll end here. We'll be back next week with the whole of the second part, the part about Amalfitano. And until then, rate, review, share with your friends, tell people to listen, tell people to tune in. It's always fun to see your comments, and thank you for all the comments for everyone who's listening live.
Wait, can I say one thing, Chad? Should we tell the audience what we hope for this season?
Oh, yeah.
So what we're hoping, avid listeners and viewers, is that instead of a strong beginning and viewer and listenership slowly dwindling, we're hoping to build towards a grand crescendo at the end. So tell your friends.
It's sort of like a rocket ship taking off, which is when we were talking about needing a messiah in technology, is all we really need is Elon. We don't need an apocalypse, we just need Elon.